Hello everybody, and thank you for joining our Net Zero Schools webinar. This is the third in our series. We will be recording this webinar and it will go up on a link on the environmental webpage so that you can review it. Today's content, we're going to be talking about the route map to net zero. Denise Rowley is kindly joining us. She's the Net Zero Carbon Planning Officer for the Church of England. We've also got Tom Wood. He's a statistician who has very cleverly pulled together the Energy Footprint Toolkit for schools. He's going to talk a bit about that. And then the bulk of the session will be with Matt Fulford, who's a consultant and director for Inspired Efficiency. And he's been doing a number of energy audits in church schools. So he's going to be talking about the findings from all of those that he's collated, and also been giving us some real world examples of those detailed net zero action plans that he's implemented in schools as well. So it's going to be a really helpful session. If you can, please do interact with us by putting questions in the Q&A function. You'll also be able to upvote questions as well, so we can see which are the priority ones. Please do as well, if you can put into the chat any points that you want us to raise as well, and do keep in touch. So on that, I'll hand over to Denise Rowley, and she can kick us off with the route map introduction. Thank you, Denise.
Thanks, Robin. I'm just going to share my screen. So perhaps, Robin, you can just give me a thumbs up if you can see that. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Some of you may have heard me speak previously on the route map and the consultation exercise that we conducted. I'm only going to give you a very quick recap on that. And today I'm just really going to give you some headlines from our review of the consultation feedback and the way that the route map is going forward. So you'll see from the slide that we launched the route map in last October. We did a consultation and that closed in February. And the route map itself is the action plan to deliver the General Synod motion of February 2020. And that motion recognised that the global climate emergency is a crisis for God's creation and a fundamental injustice. And it called for a plan of action to achieve year-on-year reductions in emissions to achieve net zero by 2030. So that's what the document is. And we consulted widely, and we're now, the Net Zero Carbon Committee has reviewed all of the responses, and we're revising the document on the basis of that. So in terms of the feedback, first of all, if you responded to the consultation, a huge thank you from the committee, and particularly pass on our thanks to everyone who was involved in formulating your response, because we know that a lot of work went into people's responses, and we are really grateful for the time and consideration that has gone into that, which has helped us to shape the document further. We also appreciated any explanations of where you felt that the document wasn't correct, and we've taken those into consideration as well. So in total, we had 144 responses and 4 late emailed responses. And of those, we received responses from nearly all of the dioceses, 17 cathedrals, and we had 10 responses from DBEs or MATs that were separate from diocese responses. So we had a really good coverage of respondents. As you can see from the graph, the majority of responses were positive. The dark blue and the green were yes and partially, and that equated to 83% of people thinking that the route map would deliver or does set out what is needed to achieve the intention of reaching net zero by 2030. However, we also received responses in answer to this question that there were reservations, principally around resourcing, and that's finance, people, time and skills. And there were also some conflicting comments about whether milestones should be brought forward to recognise the urgency of the climate emergency, or push back for those people that haven't yet started on the net zero journey. So the committee has considered all of this, and we have amended some of the milestones to reflect this, particularly those that relate to the green energy tariffs. Some of the milestones suggest that you transfer to a green energy tariff, and we have pushed those back because we acknowledge the turmoil in the energy markets and that switching is just not feasible at the moment. The final document will look substantially similar to what you've already seen during the consultation. Sections 1 and 2 have changed. They were about the consultation, so they're now about the document and also the definition and scope of what net zero carbon is. And we've added 2 new sections at the end. One is on reporting and one which recognises the challenges of meeting net zero. The bulk of the document looks the same, but we have reviewed all of the content. We've reviewed the milestones. Some of those we've removed and turned them into actions, and we've added a few new ones where we thought those were appropriate. So this is a very busy slide, and I don't expect you to be able to read all of this, but it does just show you the milestones for the schools section. And you will recall that there were a number more milestones in the consultation document. So we've trimmed these down, and these are the key ones that we feel are needed to help you to be the main actions to get you to net zero by 2030. We've taken the opportunity in the schools section to align wherever possible with the DFE draft sustainability and climate change strategy. And there are also a few more actions within the document which weren't there before. Throughout the whole document, the key messages are the same for all of the different types of buildings, and these are really to consider the easy wins, how you can reduce the emissions, establish working groups, gather data, encourage behaviour change, switch to contracts, green tariffs when that's possible, particularly at the point of contract renewal. Think about replacing LED lighting or lighting with LEDs, and consider how you can reduce travel and encourage greener forms of travel. Don't forget to review the other sections of the document, in particular the travel section, because work-related travel is within scope. And then the other parts of section 5 include overarching topics, and these have a number of milestones for the national church to provide support, for example, developing communications materials, collating case studies, increasing fundraising capacity, continuing to develop guidance and deliver webinars like this. So I hope that gives you a very, very quick overview of the route map. And now I'm going to hand back to Robin.
Thank you, Denise. We had one question in the chat. Forgive me if you dealt with it in your presentation, but the question was about when the revised route map document is planned to be published. Are you able to give us a bit of an update on the timeframe? Thank you.
Yes, of course I can. So the route map is currently going through its final stages of internal review. It will be going to the National Environment Working Group before the end of the month. And then we'll be taking it to the General Synod in July. So if the document is approved in July, it will be rolled out after that.
Thank you. There's also a question in the Q&A from Claire Hudson. She says, how are you going to tackle the issue of funding the changes need to get to net zero? Are you able to quickly address that one? Thank you.
We do recognise that funding is a particular issue for schools, and there will be a need for more public sector funding, which obviously we have no control over, but we will be looking at any mechanisms that we've got to perhaps lobby for funding in that area. More widely for the document, the funding section has been substantially revised and rewritten, so you will see a lot of changes to that section of the document, which will hopefully provide a lot more guidance. We do have some webinars on funding as well, so they'd be worth having a check out.
Thank you, Denise. We've also got a question from Paul, who talks about not having much time to carry out the 2022 actions. I just want to give Paul a bit of reassurance, and anyone else who's thinking that on this webinar, that we're working really hard, particularly around where materials are required. So we're going to be working to try and help with that sort of resourcing to make sure that any 2022 actions are adequately provided for, so you're able to put those into action in enough time. Unless anybody's got any other questions, let me just double check. I don't think there are. I might just then say thank you very much. Oh, we've got one from Nigel. He's thinking about, as well as public sector funding, does the consultation document note the potential of community energy funding? So yeah, community energy funding is something that we've been talking about and are getting information on, particularly from projects that have happened in schools. So if there are, if there are examples, please do make them known to us, because we'd be interested to hear about them, wouldn't we, Denise? I don't know if you've got anything else to add on that one.
No, all sources of funding are obviously, if anyone's got examples that we haven't covered, we would be really pleased to hear about this.
Yeah, thank you. Well, if you don't mind, everybody, we're going to move on to Tom Wood. Appreciate there might be other questions that come through. Keep them coming, and if we can't deal with them in the session, we'll take them away, and we'll try and follow up on those. So, Tom, take it away. The EFT. Tell us all about it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Now, let me just share my screen. Here we go. Okay, so as I understand it, a lot of the people on this webinar have already seen my EFT demo many times before. So this is really just a quick whistle stop for the benefit of those of you that haven't. So my name is Tom Wood. I've been a statistical researcher in the research and stats team for just over a year now. And I've mainly at my time here been working on various ways of measuring the Church of England's carbon footprint for all sorts of buildings, including schools. So in order to measure our carbon footprint, we need some data. First, just to run through why we're collecting this data to begin with. It's to do with our General Synod targets to be net zero carbon by 2030, which came about in Synod in 2020. In order to meet net zero, we need to know what our emissions are, where they're coming from, how much carbon we emit. And churches, housing, offices, and most importantly for today's schools, are all part of our net zero target. So with that in mind, I've created the Schools Energy Footprint Tool, which is part of the wider Church of England Energy Toolkit. There are, due to make it flexible and very user-friendly for schools, there are two types of data that the Schools Energy Footprint Tool can accept. We need either data from the school's display energy certificate, which is something that every public building is obliged to have. You can retrieve one from your school from this webpage, findenergycertificate.digital.communities.gov.uk. Alternatively, you could use the school's own energy bills. That will have a kilowatt hour figure for how much gas or electric or whatever heating fuel you use how much you've used over the year. So whichever one works for your school, you can use either one. In terms of what the energy toolkit will display once you finish filling it out, it will give you some weather adjusted figures for gross and net CO2. So the idea of a weather adjusted figure is because each year the weather is warmer or colder, we've just come out of a very, very cold April, as a result of that, the energy use in your school is likely to have gone up and down. You'll have the heating on for longer if it's been a colder year. So the idea of giving a weather adjusted figure is it gives you an indicator when you compare between years of whether or not you have the reduction in your energy use has been because you've genuinely improved your energy use practices or just because it was warmer that year. The energy toolkit will also give you energy efficiency ratings based on the size of the building in terms of square meters and its occupancy in terms of number of pupils. In terms of timelines, we've opened the Energy Toolkit now for collection of 2021 data. If you go to the webpage eft.parishreturns.info, you can fill it out. If you're from a diocese, you probably already have an existing parish returns account, which that would, and if you log in, that we're using those credentials, you'll be able to access the whole Energy Toolkit for your diocese, including all the schools. If you're an individual school, you can register an account that will give you access to just your school that you're responsible for. To do that, you'll need a building password from your diocese. So get in touch with your diocesan environmental officer for them to supply you with that. Our deadline for data collection is the 31st of July. So, yeah, we've got, that gives us 3 months. So, yeah, plenty of, well, hopefully that's enough time. I would normally do a demo of the toolkit, but I understand, as I said earlier, I understand most people have already seen it before. For those of you that haven't, there's a YouTube video available that will show you everything I'd have shown you today if I was doing a demo. That's the YouTube link there. If you can't memorize that for very understandable reasons, because it's a YouTube link, type CofE stats, all one word, into YouTube, and you should be able to find it that way. If you need to get in touch with me, my email address is there, tom.wood@churchofengland.org. And that's it for me. I'll open up to any questions in the time being.
Thanks, Tom. That's really great. We have had a question that's come through about whether or not the carbon footprint tool only measures emissions from energy generation. Or I think maybe they mean, does it measure any emissions from energy generation?
Yes, if you have solar panels and you're entering from your energy bills, actually, if you've got, yeah, no, actually work with the DC one as well. If you have solar panels on your school and you have the details of how much energy they're generating, you can enter those details in, and it will calculate your carbon footprint, taking that into account, and also taking into account potentially any exports that are coming from your school and reducing the sort of load on the energy grid from other, used by others. So
that leads us nicely into the next question, which talks about whether or not the EFT compensates for solar passive gain. I'm hoping you know what that means.
I think that's the question I was just reading, and I think that was what I was trying to answer. Yes, it does. It takes into account, if you've got solar panels, you can enter details of the energy generation. Yeah.
Thank you. There's another question. So do individual schools have to add our data and upload is another question. What are the ways in which people can interact with this?
Ideally, we'd like schools to fill it in. I think that's mainly because if the school is trying to actively reduce its carbon footprint, then this tool is really useful for them to do that. They can see what their carbon footprint is, and they can fill it out each year and see how they're tracking progress. If a school isn't able to do it for whatever reason, they don't have the time or capacity, the diocese is able to fill it in on their behalf. But I think it's much better, I think, if schools do it themselves, just because that gives them that chance to engage with the data and engage with and see their emissions figures and yeah, use this tool to help understand what their carbon footprint is year on year.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going between the Q&A and the chat. So in the chat, we've got, does it measure alternative fuel types, oil, LPG, and biomass? Yes, it does.
Yeah, you can tick what, you'll be prompted to tick what type, to specify what type of fuels you're using, gas, electric, oil, or others. I've just seen something about the comment about the solar gain, sunny weather and south-facing windows. I think we've got the weather-adjusted figures, which are, we've got some weather-adjusted formula that take into account the sort of degree days. I think knowing about south-facing, which will obviously, sunny weather is going to be part of that. In terms of south-facing windows, that would require me to know more about the school's design, the design of every Church of England school, I think, and that's something that I'm not able to account for. Yeah, but in terms of sunny weather, that's part of the degree day formula that forms part of the weather adjustments.
Thanks, Tom. We've got some more questions that's come in. So we've got some from about school food, transport, buying of resources. Is that included or not? So it's not included at this point.
Not at this point. We're trialing some stuff around emissions from work-related travel with churches this year, but we're not quite ready to progress to that with schools. It's quite difficult to get some of these estimates properly. So we're trialing it with churches at the moment, and hopefully in future years we'll be able to move on to schools.
We've also got a question from about whether or not it's possible to find out who the contact is for the diocese for sustainability. So I don't know, actually, I think Denise, have you raised your hand? I didn't know if you wanted to come in at that point to talk about the DEOs.
I was actually going to come in on the point of buying procurement and school food and things like that. Those are not within the current scope of the net zero 2030 target. So they are obviously something that a school can work on. That's brilliant, but it's not within the current target. So I'm sure that as and when these things become part of the target, then Tom and the rest of the team will be working on tools for that, but not at the moment. And in terms of who is the contact for sustainability, we do have a web page on the, Catherine's just added it into the chat for you. There's a web page indicating which is your local diocesan environment officer, and there's a map there which you can use to find that.
Okay, thanks, David.
Thanks, Denise. Somebody's asked a bit of a point of clarity around interim scope 3 targets. I don't know if you can see that in the chat, whether or not those, if you've got any comments on that.
If you look at the scope within the document, you'll see that there are items that are currently within scope, items that are being considered. So there's green items which are in scope now. There's amber items which will be net zero after 2030, and then we've got red items which are not included in target. And within the net zero after 2030, there are a couple of items that are being considered on a regular basis as to whether they should be included in the target. But in terms of sort of interim scope 3 targets, no, nothing at present. There is a lot to do just getting buildings and travel to net zero, and those are going to be our biggest emissions, so we really do need to focus on those. If you've got scope and time to start dealing with some of the others, then that's absolutely brilliant, but we need to focus on the biggest emitting items.
Thanks, Denise. There's one last question in the chat about school data and what we're going to do with it. Tom, I don't know if you've seen that. It's about, actually, it's in the Q&A. Whether there'll be a comparison, national, local, or similar, in terms of how that data is interpreted and what we want to do with it.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the research and stats team, we use it for annual reports on progress towards the Church of England's net zero target. The first one we published, we're planning on publishing year on year progress towards the Church's net zero targets, and that will include the contribution from schools. So that is something, that's what we use the data for.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks. And if there are any other questions that come through, we will try and follow up with those after the webinar. But thank you for all of the questions that you've put in the chat. Much appreciated. And thank you, Tom. So if I can hand over to Matt Fulford now to take us through his energy audits and action plans. Thank you. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Robin. Hopefully you can see the slides there. If someone can say yes or thumbs up. Thank you. Excellent. That's always nice to know before I start diving into it. So yes, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today. Hopefully what I'm about to share with you will be helpful and enlightening, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions coming through on the Q&A. To deal with that. So I'm going to sort of present this probably up to around about 5, and then we'll deal with Q&A after that. Just get the slides working. There you go. So I'm going to sort of whiz through a little bit on why we're trying to reduce and why we're trying to get to net zero. I'm sure that will all be very well understood by many people. Understanding where you are, where you want to be, the big bit, what needs to be done to get there. That's really where I want to share a lot of our learnings from a lot of recent school audits, and then looking at some strategies. I'll touch on the funding question to go there. But hopefully what I'll be leaving you with is the idea that actually net zero is achievable in schools. We can do it with the tech that we have today, and the knowledge and all the skills and supply chains that we have in place today. We don't need some special magic silver bullet to be invented. What we do need is the drive to go forward, and we clearly need the funding. So in terms of why on earth we're finding that schools, and we interviewed a number of schools through the Wayfinders programme, which was looking at the big energy emitters within the Church of England. So that included some large churches, some offices, as well as some large schools, and actually those particularly tended to focus slightly more on secondary schools, whereas other analysis we've done, which I'll share with you later in this, focuses slightly more heavily on primary schools, because we know we have many more of those on the Church of England estate. So we did lots of these questions with the Wayfinders programme, and asked people, well, what is it? Drove them there. Clearly, the big thing at the moment is economic drivers. So we know that an awful lot of people are looking at this because they want to reduce their energy bills, and energy bills are going up massively. We are seeing generally in the market about a doubling on electricity prices and a tripling on gas rates, which is incredibly difficult for an awful lot of people, particularly when you haven't got the domestic cap there. So there are some incredibly difficult times ahead. Obviously, that depends on when you last procured your energy and what rates you were paying, etc. But very, very difficult times coming up through on energy prices. We clearly know the environmental stuff. I'm not going to stand or sit here and give a talk on climate change and what's happening. But a number of schools did mention to us that their pupil population is incredibly motivated by this, and particularly within the secondary sector, saying that they've got many students in recent years have gone on strike from school with the student strike movement to make their voices heard on that as well. So you'll probably all be clear and aware of those. And then there's very much of a social and moral and everything else driver behind this. So the one that's been there for quite a long time and clearly is driving a number of schools is obviously this is fifth marker mission, caring for creation, and to need to do that. What really has, I think, shone a light on kind of the moral and social reasons for doing this is obviously the war in Ukraine going on at the moment. I've had schools contact me who've literally received bills that look like that you can see on the right hand side of your screen, saying, I really feel very uncomfortable and I do not want to pay some of my school budget to Gazprom because I know where it's going to end up. And that's a reality of what is absolutely happening up there. So I know a number of people trying to avoid that as well. So I'm sure many of those you'll recognise. In understanding where you are, and this sort of very much feeds back into the energy footprinting tool, what is your starting point? That is going to give you the answers and really the display energy certificates that look like this. In fact, the format's changed often very recently, but they essentially look the same. They're just a bit green on these things. You will have that will outline where you are. If you have a school that's over 250 square meters, you are legally required to have and display one of these certificates, which ought to be in date. Many aren't, so do have a look and check that you are complying with that legal obligation in there. It will show you your trend for your last 3 years. If I put that on there. This part here will show you your trend for your last 3 years in terms of your energy consumption, with the light blue and the dark blue in there being heating and electricity. And if there's a little bit of grey beneath the line, that's where your renewables come in as well. So you can see how you're doing over the year. You can see that this example deck shows a nice reduction year on year, which is good. Just be aware though, some of the carbon factors are out of date. So if you're trying to compare the carbon factors that are used on a deck with perhaps some of the carbon factors that may be coming out of the EFT, they probably won't correlate because the deck ones are grossly out of date. That's government policy for you. They do need to update them. Apparently they're thinking about it, but there you go. So that'll tell you where you are. Then there's a question of, well, we know where we are, but how does that compare to everybody else? I think there was a question I saw coming through on the chat or Q&A about that earlier. And we can really start to tell you that, because what I'm going to go through now is the analysis based on 116 Church of England school audits that we've delivered in the last, I say 6 months, I think it's probably 4 actually. As you can tell how busy we've been. These are all primary schools, because actually we've gone around about 4 dioceses now and looked at all of their Church of England schools, and barring about 3, they have all been primary schools. So this is probably going to, I thought if I kept it as primary school data, it's slightly easier to make comparisons, and it's going to be far more applicable to you than if I focused on the secondary school side of things. Average floor area, they are small schools that we've tended to be looking at and finding out there on the Church of England estate. So about 1,120 metres squared, that sort of thing. Of that, we've got an average school, and we know that average school is using about 44,500 kilowatt hours of electricity a year and about 112,000 kilowatt hours of thermal energy. And I use the term thermal energy to cover, it could be gas, oil, biomass, LPG, whatever that might be that you're using to create heat there. In some cases, it can be electricity. So from that, we know that the annual energy bill on the what were now kind of historic energy rates, so what you have been paying, is just under £12,000, and each school is emitting just over 33 tonnes of carbon emissions. That's what an average school looks like. But just to prove that there is no such thing as an average, these are all the 116 primary schools and their carbon emissions. And you can see there is a 9-fold difference between the lowest carbon emitting school and the highest ones up here. It is huge. The range that is out there. So if we could make every school up here down there, that would be a massive achievement. But obviously we want to make every school 0, so it doesn't even feature on this graph at all. But you can start to see that the range of different types of schools out there, and the range of carbon emissions up there. So there is no such thing as the average, but at least you know we are. With electricity, this is sort of the normal consumption across all those schools out there, and where that benchmarks to be. So you can see an awful lot coming in sort of below that 50 kilowatt hours per square metre per year mark. And then we've got some interesting ones going on up here where there are certain problems and issues with the school. Similar things with thermal energy, this sort of very long tail and this slightly worrying peak. Some of these might be a data issue, but actually are more likely to be caused by issues in terms of plant running all the time when it shouldn't be. So that's where those schools tend to be. So which is why the energy footprinting tool and other checks that you can do can be really useful, because if you are in this category up here, then you can take immediate action. So you can go along and check your school. This is actually the modern format of the deck report. Sorry, I said it's more green, it's actually more blue. So this is your deck certificate. You should have that displayed to somebody in your reception area. It should be a publicly accessible area, and you can go and have a look at that. This table at the bottom here is the most useful one in terms of giving you numbers, and it will tell you how much energy you are using. And up here will tell you how big you are, and if you multiply the two together, you will get to the total consumption. So you have in there figures that say how much energy and electricity you're using in kilowatt hours per metre squared per year. What we found from our studies out there is the electricity one, you really ought to be below 50. Worry if you're above it, you're doing something wrong and you need to correct that. And with the other fuels, which is essentially the thermal fuels in there, we're finding you really ought to be below 120. Again, if you're above that, then worry something is going wrong. We're finding, as I mentioned earlier, the decks are slightly out of date. So we're typically seeing the deck assessment of what a typical school should be using to be low in terms of electricity, but high in terms of heating fuels, essentially thermal fuels. So you may look at it and think, oh gosh, I'm doing badly in terms of electricity. We found, yeah, so are an awful lot of schools. It's because we've got much more IT dense and actually gradually moving over to electrification of various bits and pieces over time. and the deck factors are based on something which is actually quite historic. But you may look at that and go, oh, great, we're doing fine for heating, but maybe you're not, because I think the deck overestimates what the typical is. So I would use 50 and 120 as your guidelines. If you're over those figures, then worry and take some prompt action, because you are a very high consumer if you're over those. Considering where school energy is being used, and this is a pie chart of data from actually 12 schools where we had really good submetering information. They're fairly new schools, which is why the submetering has been in place. And you may find it interesting to look at where a typical school energy consumption is being used. You can see almost half of it being used on the heating, 11% on the hot water, and quite a large amount in this grey here, which is the kitchen power, 17% being used in terms of electricity in kitchens, depending on obviously whether schools have their in-house catering or whether they're getting cooked meals in from elsewhere and just serving them. And then sort of lighting in as the next item, 9% in there. And that's in terms of the kilowatt hours that are used. But when you switch that to the cost of energy, you may be surprised to see that actually it's the amount of electricity being used in the kitchen, which is actually costing, and this is a set of primary schools, costing primary schools a large amount of money, in fact the biggest single area, and then heating and lighting come in to be the next two largest areas in terms of cost. And that's because gas costs less than electricity in there. So you start to see the shift with the cost of putting a greater focus on the electrical items that are there. So that tends to be how it breaks down. Every school, as I say, is different. Not quite any one thing as an average, but that's where we go. And that's really what we've got to try and save and address with moving to net zero carbon. So we looked at these 116 schools, and we have then studied what is 1,200 recommendations that have been made with regard to energy saving and decarbonisation within these schools. And that's really the data I want to share with you now on that. So every school we looked at goes right back down, had individual recommendations, all costed, and we've pulled all of those together to share this data with you. And really, because I know that energy is a massive issue and energy bills are a massive issue, I wanted to start off with the quick wins that we've identified in a lot of the schools out there. In fact, we found what we're saying our quick wins in 70% of the schools had one of the things I'm about to run through with you around how they can save energy. So external lighting time clocks was a biggie. A lot of external lighting left on during the day because the time clock's wrong, no one knows where it is, normally hiding in the back of a cupboard or a boiler room somewhere, and just getting those set up right. Doesn't really cost you anything, takes a little bit of time and effort to do it, but that's one quick win that many schools can make. Movement sensors on the lighting. Again, we're finding a number of schools have these motion sensors, PIRs, but actually a lot of the time they're set up wrongly. They look like this. It's a picture of my hand pulling out a motion sensor, and you'll notice if you look very carefully there are 3 little dials on the side of it which set how long the light stays on for after the last point in time that movement was detected, set how sensitive it is, and set the light level at which they won't bother bringing the light on. I think I'm very, very surprised if I ever see one of these sensors that's actually ever been set up correctly. I would say probably 9 times out of 10, they've taken the sensor out of the packet, they've installed it, they've shoved it in the ceiling, that's great. They haven't adjusted those settings on them. So we're seeing lighting staying on in corridors for 20 minutes after the last person walked through it, for example. It only needs to be a minute or two. And those kind of items out there. Again, all fairly simple items that can be changed and can deliver energy savings. The real biggie in terms of saving lots of energy is the heating controls. We found a huge number of schools with heating controls that the school didn't understand. They didn't really know how to use them properly or been set up inappropriately. A lot of schools not using their programmers to turn off heating and hot water and ventilation or whatever other systems they could turn off during holiday periods, not turning off for the warmer weather. So not just the summer holidays, but actually, you know, schools turning off their heating from now, really up until the end of September. Controls can do that automatically, but the vast majority aren't set up to do that. We found a lot of timings set up really not appropriate to how the school was being used, either because the schools didn't understand how the timers worked in terms of they had a warm-up period to them, but actually especially hot water. We found that hot water time was being left on for a very, very long period of time when it wasn't really needed. In there, so there's some thoughts on that, and all sorts of various set points. Some schools running at 16 degrees and some are running at 25. Just seeing where they are and how over time different people personal preferences have maybe led to some inappropriate settings being set up in there. Another big area where we saw some quick wins to be had within IT, and particularly setting the power saving settings right on large equipment, the copiers and the printers. The copiers are getting better. The service engineers are much better at being on top of that. But actually having IT systems which automatically turn off computers at the end of the day, it can be done. And ideally automatic off and manual on is where we want to go to. We have seen a number of schools which have an automatic startup on their IT computers. So they fire up every single computer in the school automatically at 8 o'clock in the morning or a similar time. And that really has been shown to be very wasteful of energy. So automatic to power off the computer, but manual to turn it on in the morning, because if you don't need the computer on, then you don't turn it off. So yeah, do try and avoid that automatic start on computers. That is being seen as very wasteful. Some other things, getting a little bit more emotive. Large number of schools have got nice water coolers next to their kitchen sinks. The kitchen sink's got perfectly good, really high quality cold water that will come out of its tap, and we don't need a separate refrigeration unit next to it, which is consuming a load of energy 24/7, cooling down a bottle of water. Sometimes they're plumbed in directly, but sometimes they even have nice large amounts of plastic bottles on top of them as well. So actually, can those be removed? There may be an item that we really don't need to be having going forward. I highlighted earlier with the pie charts that actually kitchen energy use can be really high if you've got kitchen staff. They can benefit some good training on how to appropriately use their kitchen equipment, particularly things like turning on ovens and other equipment at the start of the day. Many come in and the first thing they do after turning the lights on is turn on all of the ovens, which is really not necessary. They need to be turned on about 8 minutes, the average oven takes to warm up. So a little bit of training can really deliver some big savings in there. And if you're looking to save some money, do please check the VAT and climate change levy status. No schools really should be paying anything over 5% VAT, and you certainly shouldn't be paying climate change levy. If you are, you need to notify your suppliers, and you can get that changed and actually get some rebates back in there as well. So it's one to look at. I mean, the typical school, and I'm talking about the typical primary school on the estate that we were looking at. So it's all Church of England primary schools in here. A typical primary school can go along and save £250 by looking at these quick win items. And that could save 2% of the total energy consumption on the CFE school estate. So there's a starting point for you. Then we come to what will be the more classic and probably the things you have in your minds well in any case. LED lighting. We found that 97% of the schools, Church of England primary schools that we went round, had opportunities to replace their lighting. We are seeing lots of it being done, often being done on a piecemeal basis. Where units have failed, they are now almost all going back in with LED units. And as rooms are being refurbished, they're all going to LED. But let's say there's only 3% of schools which had done all of their LED everywhere. 97% had some opportunity. The big figure on this is actually we can reduce electrical consumption by about 1/3 across all of our CFE schools if we just change the lighting to LEDs. I found that a really large figure out there, but it's certainly one that bears true. And if you want to know where that figure's come from, we have counted every single light in every single one of those 116 schools and worked it up from every single light bulb within those schools. So I'm fairly confident that those figures are right. Typically, we can see a saving of about £2,000 per year in electricity bills, and LED lighting's got a payback of about 7 years. So we're getting sort of a fairly fast payback in there as well. Don't forget those movement sensors. They can give you a little bit more of a saving in there. Sadly, we are seeing that government grants are no longer going into things like LED lighting. I've touched on funding a little bit later because I think that's the most craziest policy decision ever made by government. But we'll talk about that in a moment. So we move on from the classic one, the one that's top of everybody's list of lighting, onto the next ones, which is about fabric insulation. And it's really important that we are wrapping up our schools to keep them nice and warm and keep the heat inside them in there. And we found about a third of schools have uninsulated cavity walls. We're all used to doing this at home, but actually we're finding schools in a far worse condition than at most houses. If schools have cavity walls, then get the insulation in there, and you can see the typical savings. Again, about a third of schools, there's quite a lot of correlation between the ones that need cavity walls and the ones that need roof insulation as well. Yeah, about a third of schools have just basic roof insulation that needs to be done. So I'm talking about, you know, rolling out quilts of insulation into accessible lofts or above suspended ceilings. Typically, we're using pads at the same size as suspended ceiling tile. So you've got easy voids you can very simply get into and put insulation in. Again, about a third of schools needing that. And about half of schools have uninsulated pipework within their boiler rooms. Mainly it's the fittings. And it does seem to be that people plumbers and mechanical engineers, when they're going in and replacing the boilers, are sticking the insulation on the straight bits of pipe and missing out all of these massive big bits of fittings, all the valves and pumps and strainers and everything else that are in the plant rooms are left uninsulated. So they are rather warm in there and wasting an awful lot of heat. So there's a really big opportunity in there as well. We found another number of other measures, draft proofing, adding in new suspended ceilings in a number of places, and insulating beneath the suspended timber floors that are commonplace in many of the Victorian era schools on the ground floor. You can get insulation in up underneath the timber floors if done correctly and properly. They were less common, but they certainly exist out there as well. Then we come on to window replacement. We found just over half of the schools still have single glazed windows remaining on them. It might only be the odd window here and there, but actually on some schools it's almost all of the windows. So it does vary a lot. But you should expect that about half of your schools will still have some single glazing on them. And if we average out the schools, those 50% of schools that needed it done, the average cost of those schools where it was applicable would be about £25,000 per school. So we're not talking about a small amount of money that's needed to go onto this. And you can see the energy savings that could deliver there. Now, when we add all of those fabric improvements together, the cavity in the roof, as well as the walls I was talking about, if we just wrapped up our schools and made them better insulated, we know we could save about 9% of the gas and oil and LPG usage across that school estate just by getting them better insulated in there. The other area that comes up quite a lot that people think about early is PV panels. And generating electricity from sunshine. And of all the schools we went round to look at, 83% of those schools have viable PV opportunities. So yeah, it's not all schools. Some don't have the right facing roofs. They're heavily shaded. They're highly listed, and it would be very prominent on the facade. And some have really complicated roofs where you just can't really even squeeze that many panels in. But 83% of schools really do have a viable opportunity. On those schools where it is viable, we're seeing that PV could generate about a third of the electrical use of that school, so current electrical use of the school in there. So it can make a pretty decent contribution to that and save schools just over £2,000 a year. Typically, we're seeing paybacks of just over 10 years on PV measures. Obviously, with rising electricity prices as they are, that is about to tumble. And again, I'll mention sort of financing things later. I know we had some questions on the chat and examples being shared earlier about what are essentially power purchase arrangements. There are some good ones out there. There are some, well, there have been historically some bad ones out there, but there are most of the ones out there these days are actually rather good. So there's various things to think about there. So that's the size of the opportunity of PV panels. Hot water really needs to be seen as a major area in decarbonisation. I get a little bit annoyed with government and BEIS when they talk about heat decarbonisation, and they seem to forget that hot water is a significant part of our thermal energy consumption. I would really suggest this is the first part and the first step that a lot of schools can make, and many have, to reduce their carbon emissions and actually to be way more efficient. So this is about taking centralized hot water, typically heated by gas boilers or into hot water tanks, or even direct gas heaters into large hot water tanks, and moving it to primarily electric point of use. So these units that sit underneath sinks, or slightly larger versions, such as those, often mounted on a wall, in toilets and kitchen areas and those and the like, and they heat hot water into those and provide that directly to tap that is in very close proximity. And because you've virtually got no long lengths of pipework at all, Legionella risks reduce massively, and we've got no major area of stored hot water. So HSE see this as a very low risk hot water installation. We saw it as typical on about 45% of schools would really benefit from moving to electric point of use hot water heating. Interestingly, the ones where we're saying they wouldn't benefit of it are generally those where they already have actually electric point of use throughout their whole school. So if there's one thing that we could do, then getting this electric hot water sort of approach to all schools everywhere would make a massive difference, and would mean you weren't burning any fossil fuels, certainly in the summer period at all. And some of the savings, as you can see there, £680 in saving in thermal energy costs per year, and we're seeing very little increase in electricity. In fact, I've just rolled this out on a large secondary school. And they made massive savings on their gas consumption, obviously far more than this because we're talking about primaries here. And they saw no increase in their electricity at all. And we eventually worked that out that it was the electricity they saved in the hot water pumps that were running for a very large amount of time every day. They obviously saved that, and that offset the additional electricity that was used in these water heaters. They use so little to heat the water. So really big savings we can do there. So please don't ignore hot water in there. If you have to have a centralized hot water system, and it may be you've got a very large kitchen and you're struggling to do it on electrical point of use, or it may be probably more to those fewer secondary schools, but I have seen it within church primary schools as well, where you have a swimming pool. Say it's rare, but it does happen. You may still want to have a very large centralized tank full of hot water. And solutions now exist. This may look like a normal hot water tank to you, but actually this is an air source heat pump hot water tank. This unit at the top here is actually an air source heat pump. It has two ducts on the top, one to bring fresh air in and one to reject air out. So very much like flues, and will heat 220 litres of hot water by an air source heat pump dedicated specifically to doing hot water, and very much designed efficiently to deliver that. So there are centralized solutions out there, but I would say use those sparingly where you absolutely need to. And then the real biggie, moving boilers to heat pumps. If we are serious about decarbonisation, we can no longer burn fossil fuel, gas, oil, LPG, or the like in our boilers, and we're going to need to change them. Really, the solution is out there is changing them to heat pumps. Now, within that 116 schools that we're basing this on, we found there are 290 you can call them boilers. We're going to call them heat generators because some of them are generating heat in different ways than boilers, but we'll stick with them. So we know that there are often multiple boilers within one school. And so within those 116 schools, that's 21.4 megawatts of heat, which is huge. So we know we've got a lot of heat generation going on within those schools. But we did find in that we had 2 biomass boilers, 4 air source heat pumps, 3 ground source heat pumps, and 3 schools with direct electric heating already. So this isn't new. This isn't stuff that we are totally unfamiliar with. There are examples of it out there. We're particularly finding that blocks within secondary schools often already have air source heat pumps in them. Some of the modular classroom builds, the modern ones come with air source heat pumps for their heating, tend to be built into it. So in fact, many of these technologies we're already familiar with. This isn't something new, novel, that has never been seen before. Of the rest of the boilers, we know that 12% of the schools are on oil and 3% were on LPG, and all the rest are on mains gas. So we've still got quite a large amount of oil on the estate. And then we start to look at the life cycle of those boilers and how old the boilers are. And obviously we've got enough schools here to be able to make sort of statements about probably what most of the estates look like. So we know about 30% of the boilers are at end of life, and we tend to be using around about a 20-year boiler lifespan for that. Most manufacturers, the CIBSE guidelines will say it's between 15 and 20. So we've gone to the longer end of that. So 30% of boilers really need to be replaced now, or certainly in the next few years. And a further 23% of the boilers are going to reach the end of their life between 2025 and 2030. That's about 53% of the boilers we have now will need changing before the 2030 target. So if we changed all of those, the heat pumps, we'll be more than halfway there in terms of reaching the net zero target by 2030. So we ought to be doing that in any case. And what this really highlights to me is that actually we need to be taking the position that we're no longer going to install a fossil fuel boiler anywhere. If we replace those 30% of boilers that we know are end of life now, like for like, for same as a gas boiler, gas boiler for a gas boiler, an oil boiler for an oil boiler, we have lost the opportunity to address 30% of the decarbonisation that we need to do. Yeah, we've got an opportunity, and that opportunity is now, and we need to grab it with both hands. We then go on, and actually we see that in the immediate 5 years after the 2030 target, another 22%. So we can actually deal with 75% of this by natural sort of lifespans before 2035. So that's there. Now, I know there are going to be loads of questions about heat pumps. I can already see a few slipping in out the corner of my eye on the left-hand side of my screen at the moment. So I just want to run through a number of those because I haven't got time to read the questions and present at the same time. Of the heat pumps that are out there, what I really want you, if you don't already aren't aware, heat pumps come in an awful lot of different flavors, types and variants out there. I actually really dislike the generic term heat pump. For me, it's a little bit like transport. Yeah, a car, a motorbike and a bus will all get you from A to B, but they'll all do it very differently. And heat pumps are very similar out there. I've kind of divided this down into the main type of heat pumps and where the recommendations are. So air-to-air source heat pumps we found recommended in about 50% of the schools. They're very different to air-to-water source heat pumps that were appropriate in about 12% of the schools out there. There are high temperature air-to-water source heat pumps. These are in circumstances where the temperature that comes off a normal air-to-water source is not high enough. I'll come on to a little more of these later. And actually, they would have been really useful in about 3% of the schools. Now, you might find this one slightly odd. We've got air source heat pumps, but the type's yet to be determined. And that's in a third of the schools out there. You say that may seem a little bit odd, but actually these are mainly in those schools where they've got boilers that are very new, and we know they don't need to be replaced for another 15 or so years yet. And within the reports and advice, we're going, look, we think it's probably going to be air to air or air to water, but actually 15 years of technology development is a very long time. So we know it's probably going to be air source, but exactly what technology probably needs to be determined later on down the line on that. Ground source heat pumps, there are a number out there, and we certainly found a few in a couple of the schools, but they're not very vast. Particularly in the primary school area, they actually tend to be slightly more prominent in the secondary school area, and bits of direct electric heating in ad hoc areas can be useful, but not really as a total school solution in there. So that's some air source heat pumps that are installed in a school and working very well as the sole heating source in there. But let's just touch on the main types of heat pumps that we've got, and I am aware of time, so I'll go through this fairly swiftly. Ground source heat pumps, they need long or deep piles or long trenches to take the heat out of the ground. They compress that heat and then put that into the building. The internal units look a little bit like this. They're just bits of mechanical kit. They work very well with underfloor heating because they produce what we describe as a low-grade heat. So they operate really quite nicely at about 45 degrees, nudge up to 50. With heat pumps, the term we're all going to get used to is SCOPS or SCOPS. So this is a seasonal coefficient of performance, and this is a measure of how much heat you get out, or how many units of heat you get out for every unit of electricity you put in. So with a ground source heat pump, you typically get 4 units of heat out for every 1 unit of electricity you put in. If you want to call it 400% efficient, that's fine. But we would say that's got an SCOP of 4. And that's measured over the seasonal period. So it's a little bit like MPGs in cars being, when you had the actual real life tests. This is designed to be a real life test if it's got the S on the front of it for the seasonality. So that's ground source. Air to water, picture you've seen before. Very much the same principle, but it takes the heat directly from outside air and compresses it and puts it in again to heating systems. Again, that 45, 50 degrees is where they like to sit at in terms of the amount of heat they produce. You need really good flow rates around the system, so it will not work with single pipe systems. So if you've got those old single pipe systems, it won't work. If you've got microbore pipe work, it won't work. There is little internal plant with this, so if you're struggling for internal areas, it can be useful. They operate less efficiently than ground source, so about 3.5 units of heat for every 1 unit of electricity. High temperature units are now becoming increasingly more available. Most manufacturers have now got these. They basically have a 2-part system. So they have an air-to-air source, an air-to-water source part. So they're sucking heat out of the air, sticking it into a tank of water this time. And then they've got a secondary cycle that takes the heat from that tank of water and compresses that heat again to produce much higher temperatures that can go around the building. So they can get up to about 75 degrees. But your efficiency falls quite considerably. So we're now down to about 2.5 units of heat for every 1 unit of electricity you put in. And they need both space internally and outside, but they can be linked on with existing radiator systems much, much easier because they're producing that heat at 75, which is what the radiator systems tend to be designed for. Then we come to air-to-air. And this is the technology that we found to be most common within schools out there. So all those systems I talked about before compress the heat and put it into water, and that water then went around a heating system. What air-to-air does is it takes the heat, compresses it, puts it into a refrigerant gas. That refrigerant gas is then piped internally to a unit, and the units are come in different shapes and sizes, and I've got a slide on that in a moment. And then they are released, the heat is released from those units into the building. You will all be very, very familiar with this technology because when you run it in reverse cycle, it produces cooling, and that is called air conditioning. And this is essentially exactly the same. This is an air conditioning unit in heating mode. There are some very, very subtle differences between an air-to-air source heat pump and an air conditioning unit. In the air-to-air source heat pumps are designed to heat as their primary purpose and cool as their secondary purpose. So I don't know whether the question earlier about passive heat gain was because they've got schools which are struggling with overheating in summer. And if they are, then an air-to-air source heat pump can give the secondary benefit of being able to provide some comfort cooling in the summer, although we're not massively encouraging of that because it does consume energy in cooling. But it can be useful in certain circumstances. So yeah, this is an air conditioning system in heating mode and deliberately set up and commissioned and prioritized to heat. And it can warm spaces very rapidly, so it can be very useful. And most sort of school classrooms, etc., you can heat them up from cold within 20 minutes. So you haven't got those long warm-up periods you often experiencing with other heating systems out there. The external units, you had some pictures before of a number of smaller ones. You can get some bigger ones that can be quite usefully mounted up on roofs and hidden away up there. And internal units, they can come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. So you'll probably be familiar with all or most of these. You've sat in offices with these things hidden up in the suspended ceilings with the four little grills around them. You get surface mounted versions of those as well. You've probably all sat in offices or stayed in hotel rooms with these sort of units located normally at high level up on the wall or hidden behind a grille, often above the entranceway into a hotel room, and providing heating and cooling in there. These are all very, very common systems, say within hotels, within offices, and within retail environments, most of which use this as their primary heating solution and have done for years. You can also get ground-mounted ones, floor-mounted ones as well, which look very much like radiators and fan convector heaters in there. So certainly in some sort of more historic settings, they can be quite useful there. Direct electric heating can be very useful to spot heat a few areas, so lobbies and corridors and those kind of bits and pieces come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes, so we can bury them up in suspended ceilings, long linear ones in there, architecturally designed ones that look maybe a little bit like the flying saucer sweeties that you used to have, that can sit above reception desks, ones that work really well within workshops and other sorts of spaces as well in there as well. So that's a quick whistle-stop tour through those. Other measures in there, we found about 65% of schools had an easy opportunity to put in electric vehicle charging. But one really interesting point coming out of this is it doesn't need to be high capacity charging at all. The dwell, mainly looking at staff cars, the dwell time of those cars on site, they tend to be parked on the school site for 8 hours. And they can be trickle charged very happily in that amount of time. And we had a number of primary schools when we've worked through it with them all, and all they need is an outdoor external rated 13-amp plug socket, and they can plug the electric car into that, and that works really, really well. So what we've suggested to a number of primary schools, and it works for secondaries as well, is actually go ahead, install a normal outside 13-amp plug socket, same as you'd have inside of your home. But if you install that on its own dedicated 32-amp circuit, you can upgrade it for a higher capacity charger later without having to update your cabling or your internal wiring back into your distribution board. But it can often be a really good and accessible starting place for that. So what does that all mean for schools? Well, really, we need to be avoiding using any oil or gas heating for hot water. And we need to be moving over to heat pumps, and we need to be doing that now. Every boiler you put in from today onwards is a backward step in terms of reaching that 2030 target. We know we're going to need to insulate the buildings. We're going to need to save electricity from the use of making good use of LEDs, particularly. We saw how much that was contributing to the school's energy consumption in there. We may need to look at upgrading electricity supplies, although we didn't actually find that to be required in quite a significant number of schools. It certainly is in some, but in many cases you can get enough savings from the LED lighting, for example, that can free up capacity. That means you haven't got to upgrade the electricity supply, and there's normally quite a lot of spare supply within schools in any case on there. In terms of strategy, there is very much the case, and I know that there were some questions floating around earlier of needing to know what you need to know what can be done. So decarbonisation surveys of the schools, knowing where all your PV opportunities are, getting all your LED lighting scheduled out so you know what needs to be done and done everywhere. Then working out how on earth we're going to fund this. Government are really unlikely to fund LED and PV. That grant scheme has gone. So looking at other opportunities, and really interesting to see on chat earlier, those discussions about power purchase arrangements and those kind of things, which really are going to need to be the main funding solution, particularly for PV and possibly for LED lighting as well. Absolute strategy to focus on end-of-life boilers. Those boilers you're going to have to replace in any case, and looking at changing those to heat pumps. There is potentially some benefit of trying to push gas boilers on a little bit longer for the next couple of years, because we're seeing a spike in demand for heat pumps at the moment, which is causing some pressures on the market. And we're seeing technology develop and improve all the time. So if you can make a gas boiler last a little bit longer, there are potentially some benefits in there, but that's just where to play things. So and we're not really seeing schools actually changing boilers early at the moment. So but probably not a particularly strong thing in there. And we know the grant schemes go very, very, very quickly indeed. I think the last grant scheme got used up in the first 36 hours. So being ready to get the funding when it is announced is absolutely key. And just turning to funding as the last thing I talk about, the Salix loan scheme that was in place, where you could go along to Salix and get a zero interest loan that was paid back over 8 years, suddenly got pulled and finished in April last year. I think that is the most ridiculous piece of policy government has ever made. And I think I could possibly go back centuries on making that statement. Absolutely crazy. And we really ought to be lobbying hard for a return on that. And I know that DFE are trying to think about actually how they can fill that gap, because that really would provide a funding solution for things like LED lighting out there, as well as hot water and other measures. So that would be really useful if we could have that back. But it has now finished, so it's not available. The current funding is all around the public sector decarbonisation scheme, and there have been some big schemes over the last 18 months. So we had a £1 billion scheme, then we had a £75 million scheme, PSDS3, which all the results haven't been announced yet, but was quite a large scheme as well. But they've all been hugely oversubscribed. And this is the whole public sector in there. So you're competing against the NHS and prisons and police stations and fire brigades, etc., etc. So there's a lot of competition for that money. We are expecting the next round of the public sector decarbonisation scheme to be announced probably sometime around September. Interestingly, we've been told it's not going to be PSDS4. Apparently it's going to be PSDS3B. I don't know. Anyway, I don't make up the numbers. So that is expected to be coming through sometime in September, and will fund the cost difference between a like-for-like boiler replacement and a heat pump going in out there. But as mentioned many times, we are going to need to look at other solutions for electrical saving items. So PVs, LEDs aren't going to be able to be funded by that. But do get lobbying DFE for an improvement and a resurrection of some of those loan schemes, because that would be massively useful. I've gone a little bit over my time, but I hope I've left enough time for Q&A in there. So I will have a look through those questions now and hand back over to Robin whilst I do so.
Thank you, Matt, for an extremely interesting, and oh, sorry, you're sharing your screen still, just so you're aware.
Yeah, I just need to press the right button at the right time, and now I can't find the right button.
No.
That's fine. I will stop sharing. Stop sharing, that's the word button. There we go, we stopped sharing. Great.
Okay, right, that's good. Yeah, no, thank you for that. Enormously comprehensive and yeah, extremely interesting and helpful, kind of all the different areas that we need to be thinking about. And it was really helpful. Your starting point was the drivers, the main drivers for schools in wanting to engage in this particular agenda. So there are a few questions within the chat, and I know, so whilst you're having a look at those, I'm sure you'll filter out, 'cause some of them sort of relate to one another. whilst you're relating, you're having a look at those, Claire has written to talk about how dioceses might be held to account on delivering on these targets. And really my reflection, particularly from your presentation, was that we're pushing at an open door here, and that dioceses and schools really recognise the challenges that they're facing, particularly around those economic drivers and the increasing in energy bills. Essentially, the route map is what we're trying to help support you as officers, the diocese and people within church schools to try and meet those targets. So if there are areas that you feel that you require support on, then do get in touch with us at the Education Office. So I'm responsible for school estates and policy management at the Church of England Education Office, and we'd be keen to hear from you, in particular, around where those challenges are and how we can provide support. And I've already mentioned that we're looking to create some materials for you in response to the route map. And really, be happy to engage with you and take feedback from you on those as and when we issue them. I hope that's given you enough time, Matt, just to quickly filter out some of those points.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to sort of, I think a number of the questions must have come through as I was speaking, and hopefully I've answered some of them as we went on. But quite a number of questions around heat pumps in there. I think some skepticism about them producing enough heat. I can assure you that a well-designed heat pump, properly designed and sized, does. I have a number of schools running on nothing other than a heat pump, and very, very successfully doing that. And air-to-air, as hopefully you managed to gather from the presentation, work very differently from air-to-water ones. So if you had a bad experience of air-to-water producing low flow temperatures, and they do in terms of their normal specification, rather than the high temperature specification, produce heat at 45 degrees or something along those lines, then air-to-air is certainly a very different way of looking at it, and can certainly provide enough heat in terms of heating the building. And other heat pumps are coming through, and I can see some other discussions on there that have reinforced that view out there. There was no mention of a hydrogen-ready gas boiler. I would just put a word of caution about hydrogen. I think there are a lot of people hoping that this is going to be a very easy replacement for mains gas, and I'm sorry to disappoint, but it isn't. We're not going to have hydrogen being pumped to us down the mains gas line anytime soon. We can get hydrogen content up to about 17–20%-ish within the mains gas line. There's a big question about where that hydrogen comes from and what it should be used for. So essentially, the hydrogen we can produce in a zero carbon way is going to be needed to use for applications where you can't use heat pumps or electricity. And that's going to be things like aviation, steel and glass making, and possibly heavy long distance goods vehicles. Where doing it, you can't really use a heat pump or electricity in those circumstances. And that's probably going to gobble up all of the hydrogen that we can produce from a green point of view. So we shouldn't be accounting for using hydrogen within our buildings primarily. Is there consideration of greenhouse gas impact of refrigerants? Oh yes, massively, massive area in the heat pump market at the moment, with all sorts of different types of refrigerant gases being used and trialled, and it's probably the biggest area of research and development. And there are essentially more layers of the Montreal Protocol coming through, which is restricting the greenhouse gas potential of refrigerants over the coming years. So we're seeing that getting better and better. All refrigerants, I'm not going to get into long talks about refrigerants, all refrigerants have different pros and cons. So some perform better and some have less global greenhouse gas emissions from them. Yeah, it is a very big focus of area, and in fact some of the biggest areas of refrigerant loss is actually in your car. So the installed systems in buildings do tend to leak an awful lot less, and many don't leak at all. So it's about being on top of those leaks that are in there. Payback periods on EV charging points was an interesting one. Most EV charging points don't pay back. there isn't really an energy saving off them. Obviously, you can charge for the energy that is provided from them, and therefore try and make a profit because you're selling your electricity at more than you are buying it for. But actually, with staff cards, we're often seeing schools not wanting to do that. So they're just looking to charge the EV drivers essentially the same amount of energy costs as it's costing to buy the electricity. So there's no profit to be made there, and therefore there isn't any payback within that on there. Now paging through the rest of that bits and pieces. Any experience of a heat pump in a school, really concerned about the lack of insulation? Yeah, what I would say is air to water source heat pumps. And I think there's two questions about how do we heat a building that is thermally efficient. So heat pumps in buildings which are not very efficient thermally are problematic, and really for those low temperature air to water source heat pumps and ground source to work well, you do need a well insulated building. And really, in any heating situation, we ought to be looking at trying to improve the insulation as the first measure. And if your boilers still got 15 years left in them, get doing the insulation now to be heat pump ready in the future. But air to air source heat pumps do tend to perform much better in the less thermally efficient buildings. I'm slightly nervous of saying that because I think I've almost just promoted wasting heat, which is not really what I want to be doing at all. But certainly if you have buildings that are thermally inefficient and you cannot do anything to them, and you're thinking you've got to go boiler, I would encourage you to look at air to air, because that can be a solution in those circumstances out there. I think that's probably dealt with most of the questions I've immediately seen. But if anybody's got any other ones, or Robin, you want to highlight any others to me, then I'm happy to take them.
Yeah, so I think any of the other points are mainly around funding and actually accumulating information through energy audits. So in terms of funding and energy audits, I don't know, Matt, if you've got a comment on the way in which schools might want to have a look at their capital and funding energy audits, or planning a programme of works through an estate strategy that way, or if you've got any experience you could share around that.
Yeah, and obviously we've done an awful lot of energy audits in schools that have been funded. So occasionally the government does provide funding. It tends to be called the Low Carbon Skills Fund, LCSF, to fund for energy audits, which they will call heat decarbonisation plans. Very, very similar. Technically, they're slightly different, but they're basically one of the same thing. In there, so do watch out for more LCSF funding come through. Where we've seen that be really successful is where dioceses and DBEs have applied for funding for all of their schools and gone in as one big application to get all of their schools done. So a number of dioceses have benefited from that. Others have sliced some out their SCA to pay for energy audits, which I understand from others that the DFE have said is a legitimate use of the SCA, because it's treated like a design fee in terms of designing the solution for net zero. So others are doing that out there as well. So yeah, I think there are definitely good economies of scale to be had if you're looking at doing schools together. So just to sort of illustrate that, when we've been doing some of these large programs, particularly within primary schools, we can go out there and audit 2 or 3 primary schools in one day. And obviously, if they're close together, then there are definitely economies of scale that can be achieved on that, rather than looking at each school individually. So yeah, we can get down to more affordable prices on that kind of thing. So those are some of the ways in which audits can be done in there.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Matt. I can't see anything else. Somebody else has just posted something in the chat. Richard has said about decarbonisation plans can only be funded through SCA linked to a capital works project. I think what he means is that it has to manifest into a project in order for that funding to be available. So I think you can't just sort of generically apply for it and then pull together a schedule of works without there being an outcome, I think is what we're just saying.
Yes, I think I've seen some views from DFE coming out, which is suggesting that that outcome doesn't need to be immediate. Okay. Now, whether that's one person's view in DFE and another person's might be different, I'm just going to have to say go and check. But I have seen them say that you know, if you have plans to decarbonise and that might be by 2030, then this is considered to be the starting point of design for that, and that would be SE. Therefore, you can use SECA. I say take advice on that, but I have seen that come through from DFE.
That's a really helpful comment. Thank you. Thanks, Matt. And thanks for the question, Richard. Stuart has come in the last few minutes to ask what looks to me to be quite a technical point.
It is. Yes, for condensing boilers to condense and to get their efficiencies, you do need to set the flow temperatures appropriately, so that actually the difference between the flow and return is quite large, because that's when condensing happens. In there, I'm not going to give any numbers on that because it does depend on the building and the heating system, which can determine that. Getting boiler flow temps right can deliver good energy savings, and so often we do see them being set up incorrectly in there. I can see weather compensation is now mentioned as well. Yep, absolutely. There's an awful lot in that whole area, and I could do a whole 2 hours talk on how to set up controls properly. What I would say is, I think we're highlighted back on that housekeeping quick wins slide at the beginning. A huge amount of schools are getting their control systems wrong, and there are massive savings to be gained from that. And whilst they are the exceptions, I have had a number of schools where we've saved them 30 or even 40% of their energy consumption just by getting their controls right. They were in a bad place to start off with. I'm not saying all schools are that bad, but there are big savings to be had there, and that can look can be very different across different schools in terms of what control most that can be, whether it's timing that's wrong, whether it's a set point that's wrong in terms of how it's the optimizer that's set up incorrectly, but there are big savings to be had there. So yes, do definitely look at controls.
Okay, one last question. We've got one in the Q&A, which asks, do you have any experience or recommendations around the use of MVHR? What does that acronym mean?
Yes, yes. So this is mechanical ventilation and heat recovery. So essentially, taking where you will be mechanically, so using a fan to drive fresh air into a building, which is becoming quite needed and more recognised, I should say, within schools now. We're in sort of COVID and post-COVID era. It's using the air that you're sucking out of the building to warm the air that's coming in. So really very, very useful where you have fans that are extracting air out of a building and blowing air into a building. And it would almost be nonsensical to install such a system without heat recovery on it. These days, and in fact, almost in building regulations, you can't. But where you've got schools where you've got an openable window, and that is your way of ventilating the place, and you haven't got a mechanical system to do that, you can't really get heat recovery through an open window pane. That doesn't work in there. So there is some question about whether it's better to have a sealed up window and have a mechanical system, or have an openable window in there, and that really does come down to literally a room by room assessment in there. I would say where you can open windows, could you say that's probably and have natural ventilation is probably preferred and is better used and does tend to be slightly more energy efficient, albeit it might use a little bit more in the winter, but it really does come down to an individual case by case basis.
My goodness, thank you, Matt. Thank you so much for your knowledge and expertise that you've shared with us today. There's a huge amount to digest. Thank you to everybody who has posted questions as well. And apologies if we haven't got around to all of them. I'll have another look. And if we haven't picked up everything, we'll try and follow up on those. Thank you to Denise as well for introducing us and going through the route map too. Much appreciated. And to Tom as well for taking us through the EFT. If anyone has any questions, please do get in touch. This webinar has been recorded and we'll pop it on the website, and you can have the link and the slides will be shared as well. So thank you again for taking the time to join us. It's very much appreciated, and do keep in touch. Thank you. Thanks everyone.